Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Small Market Podcast. I'm your host, AJ Hoffman, with my co-host, Andrew Watucky. And we are joined today with a special guest, Mr. Rex Naylor, who is the author of the book, The Forgotten Years. It's a book about Penn State football from 1977 and the 1978 seasons, right?
Yep.
Right. How you doing, Rex?
Great. How are you folks?
Good. Good to see you. That was our official little intro there for you. So
That's
Thank you.
the Forgotten Seasons.
Oh,
Hoffman.
what did I say?
You said the Forgotten Years.
Oh, did I?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It was close. That's all right. It was close.
Man, I thought I was on a roll and everything. All right.
No, I had to. Yeah, in order to master the book, I had to make a real long title and a long subtitle. So you're fine.
So, Rex, why don't you give us a little background on yourself?
Well, I've been a financial advisor for 34 years, and I was a horrific writer. So I decided to write a book. I was embarrassed at my communications with clients. So fortunately, Mike Gooman, who wrote the foreword to my book, was a running back at Penn State during the time and became Eric Dickerson's blocker for the Rams for many seasons. He was one of my investment wholesalers. So I got with Mike, and he got me contacted with Matt Millen, Matt Suey, Chuck Fusina, all the big guys back in the day. And I spent 5.5 years doing the research for the book. I want to make sure it was accurate as possible. And again, it worked. I did get better at writing. I'm average or below average. I don't think I'm a great writer by any means, but I did get better at writing. And I continued to research on we discussed before in several podcasts I have about that time period in college football. So that's again, financial advisor is my trade, but I set up my own publishing company too, because I knew I wasn't going to get chosen by any big publisher, and I didn't want all that work to go to waste. So I self-published.
So how long? So this, I don't want to say it started out as a hobby. Maybe it did. Like when did you start doing all this research and kind of, I don't know, almost like becoming a historian, I guess, in a sense of like Penn State football and stuff, like in college football? Like where did that all start then?
I was always a fan. I was born in 1967, so I don't remember much in 74 beyond, but 75 I remember some. 1977 I remember a lot. So I guess when you get to 9 or 10, you start to remember things, and that's when these seasons took off. And so I started to research about 2012, 2013, and I charted 84 games. I bought a bunch of games, every Penn State, every game during this time period before and after I bought and or acquired somehow. Somebody gave it to me. I read over 100 books in college football, and it's a passion. It's kind of a hobby, a passion. And I did that research, and sometimes the books weren't right. I had to go back and ask some of the people, did this happen? Did that happen? And I got clarified on some things. It took a while, but when I found when I did the research, the book writes itself.
Right. So when you're writing this book, or when you decided to write a book, why those seasons? You know, the forgotten seasons. Why not the seasons prior? Because Penn State had some undefeated seasons 10 years prior or so, you know, within the previous 10 to 15 years. And then, you know, in 82, they won the national championship, I believe it was. So why these years?
It's a great question. And when I was 10 years old, there was a rule in 1977, and it wasn't changed to the early 80s, that a college football team could not be on television more than 5 times over a 2-year period of time, not counting bowl games. So the imagination that you had by listening to radio, obviously I was a kid, I was glued to the radio broadcasts, and then Penn State had their own television network, so they would tape delay the games. You're right. I consider with my podcast work, talking Penn State football history, 1968 through 1975 was the heyday of Penn State football. 7 major bowl games in 8 years. And this is right after that season. But in 1976, Joe Paterno recruited 7 of the 50 parade All-Americans, the best in the country. The Mike Goomans, Bruce Clark, Matt Millen was there in that class, but he wasn't one of the parade All-Americans. So these 2 seasons, Penn State went 11-1, and they played for a national championship in 78. They did not have an opportunity to in 77 due to bowl politics, which I wrote about in my book. So nobody at Penn State remembers these teams, and these were 2 of the greatest teams that ever played there. So that's why I chose those 2 years. And I was 10, 11 years old, and I hung on every word, every highlight show, anything I could get back in the day.
Okay. Now, growing up myself personally, I was a Michigan fan. I followed them a lot, but I would see, and I'm slightly younger than you are, so I don't.
Good for you.
Yeah, right. These years, are before I was born and stuff. So I look at this. I look at Penn State when I was younger, and I'd watch them, and I watched Michigan play them. To me, they were already a blue blood program as far as college football is concerned. Would you say that these years are the years that kind of cemented that or catapulted them to that?
They were in the middle of that. You got to go back to the Carnegie report in the late 20s, where they stated that colleges were emphasizing athletics more than academics. And Penn State went without athletic scholarships from, I think, 1929 or 30 through 48. And Bob Higgins was the coach, and he had winning records. He took them to the Cotton Bowl in 40. I believe it was 1948. Then Rip Engel came on board in 1950. He was there for 15 or 16 seasons and never had a losing record. But they never got up to the top until Joe Paterno took over the program in 66. And it was the 68-69 undefeated teams back to back that cemented that. And it started to build and build and build. I think the national championship culminated it in 82. And then in 86, solidified it with the win over Miami. And I'd like to think they're a blue blood today, but when you look back, Penn State hasn't. I'm a big fan, but they haven't won a whole lot in years since 1994. And I mean, when I say big quality games, so I'm hoping this year's a little different. But I think to answer your question, I think 82 solidified it, and then 86. Or 82 put them over the top, and 87, 86 season after that solidified it.
It's really solidified that, yeah. Now, like I said, they had 3 undefeated seasons prior to the years that this book was wrote about that didn't result in a national championship. Is that strictly due to politics with the polls? Because back then, I don't want to say it's a popularity contest because you still have to win your games, but they're undefeated. They win their games and the bowl games. Why no national championship?
That's an interesting question, and I'm going to try to summarize it as quick as I can. Joe Paterno had 5 undefeated seasons in his career and only won 1 national championship of the 5. That was it. So you go back to 68, 69, Eastern football. If you remember Ben Schwartzwalder at Syracuse, they were starting to fall off. It's after Ernie Davis. It's after Larry Zonka. He ends up retiring in 73, I think. West Virginia's not there yet. They hire Bobby Bowden in the late 60s, early 70s, but they're not there yet. Pitt football is abysmal at this time period. So when you look at Penn State, they were an independent back then, and they looked at that as a conference. So most of their games were against independents, which were whom? Army, Navy, Syracuse, West Virginia, Pitt, Temple later on. They played all those teams to try to take care of each other. And they weren't that great back then. So Penn State, they never thought they could compete with the Texas USCs of the neighborhood. The one that really solidified it to Joe Paterno to change the schedule around was in 1973. They went 12-0 and finished 5th in the country. And there were 2 teams ranked ahead of them, I think, that had ties. And they weren't even really considered. And that was one other fact around that could have changed it all, but it was just sheer dumb luck. Back in 1969, Penn State's 2nd undefeated season, the polls were judged at the end of the regular season. One poll was, and one poll was judged after the bowl games. Ohio State was undefeated in '69. This is the year your Michigan Wolverines upset them.
Yep.
And these bowl games were picked before that Michigan-Ohio State game. And everybody thought, well, Ohio State, they beat them 50, I think it was 50-14 the year before. So they'll just clean up on them this year and go to the Rose Bowl and win another national title. Well, before, again, Penn State had a chance to go to the Cotton Bowl to play Texas or go back to the Orange Bowl. And you have to remember 1948, Penn State's last appearance in the Cotton Bowl, which was only 20 years before that. The black players were not allowed to stay in a hotel. Penn State had to go into a military base outside of Dallas because the team was going to stay together. It's 6 years removed from the JFK assassination. And Penn State had played in the Orange Bowl the year before and had a heck of a good time down there. So they figured they could just go to the Orange Bowl, have a good time, and not have to worry about, because Ohio State's going to win a national title again anyways. And then whenever they lost to Michigan, that's what forced Notre Dame to start playing bowl games for the first time in 50-some years, or close to 50 years.
Now, Rex, I don't want to take anything away from your book or spoil anything from that, but what's maybe your favorite story or favorite memory from those seasons?
Oh, there's many. The favorite memory was not a good one for Penn State. In 1977, it might have been the greatest year in college football history. Going into the bowl games, there was one undefeated team and 8 one-loss teams. Now, you go figure out on a 4-game playoff, I used to say this before the 12 team, you go figure out who the top 4 are. We know Texas was undefeated, they were 1, but there were 7 one-loss teams. And then plus San Diego State only had 1 loss, but they weren't considered a blue blood type of a team. So when you look at this season, 1977, Penn State was 7-5 the year before, not expected to do much. They lose to Kentucky, who may have been the best team in the country in '77, 24-20, then win out, and they don't ever get a chance to play for any type of major bowl game. As a matter of fact, they were 2 days away being 10-1 and not going to any bowl. And that really stunned me. But when I did research on that season, it was a great season to be around, and that was a fun memory. And also the player vignettes that I wrote about. I'll name one, for example. Mike Gilsonen, who was a senior in 1978, had not played hardly a down in his first 3 years at Penn State. Instead of quitting, he said, you know what, I'm going to do everything I can. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to put some weight on. I'm going to stay up here during the summer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he ends up becoming a starting secondary player, and was probably their best cover man in '78. That's a unique story of what college football, I think, is all about.
Yeah. Now, without giving away, anything that's in your book and stuff, there's a lot of politics that go on in college football, and you kind of mentioned that. Especially with those seasons and stuff. Can you give us an example of that without really giving away too much in the book? Is that possible?
Yes. Yeah. In '78, and you go back in 1975, Penn State was 9-2, and they were probably a Gator Bowl team. They had lost to number 1 Ohio State 17-9 and lost 15-14 to North Carolina State. Looking at the scores, you think, okay, that's no big deal. But Bear Bryant was 0-7-1 in his previous 8 bowl games, and he was literally on the hot seat. So he called Joe Paterno and says, don't accept the Gator Bowl. I'll get you into the Sugar Bowl. And they probably didn't deserve it, but Penn State lost 13-6. I remember watching the game. It was the first Sugar Bowl in the Superdome. And that's one example of it. In 1977, when Joe Paterno needed to favor return, Bear Bryant didn't do it. He chose a 2-loss second-place Ohio State team to come to the Sugar Bowl. So in '78, it gets real interesting. but back then the Southeast Conference had 10 teams, but they only played some of them 5 and 6 conference games for whatever reason. And, it always resorted back to, if it was a tie, who was the team that was in the longest from being in that bowl game. So Auburn and Georgia were battling it out ahead of Alabama. And they ended up tying, but Bear Bryant got worried. And he thought, well, I'm not going to, one of them's going to go, or the Auburn's going to go to the Sugar Bowl, and I'm going to be in the Gators. So he calls Joe Paterno and says, hey, let's play each other in the Gator Bowl for the national championship. and it didn't, Auburn ended up tying Georgia. So Alabama defaulted into the Sugar Bowl. But that's an interesting thing about politics. Bear Bryant had a lot of pull. As you know, being a Michigan fan, if you study the history, Woody Hayes had a ton of pull back then, and that's Bo Schembechler was the reason that they allowed teams that didn't win the conference to go to bowl games. And that was after the 73 decision against Ohio State.
Okay. Now, can you refresh my memory on that 73 decision against Ohio State?
Yeah, it was the Dennis Franklin era at Michigan. So Ohio State had to beat Michigan in order to go. They ended up tying. And at the end of the game, Woody Hayes goes over and shakes Bo's hand and says, hey, good luck in the Rose Bowl, Bo. And so, but Dennis Franklin got hurt. I think he separated his shoulder. And so the athletic directors get together and say, hey, wait a minute here. He might not play. And the next day, Bo thinks he's going to the Rose Bowl, and the athletic directors voted in Ohio State. And Bo didn't even do his television show, I understand. He come out of there, and you can't even really repeat what he said, not for virgin ears, so to speak. But that's what got it changed. And in '75, Michigan played Oklahoma in the Orange Bowl.
Okay, that's I remember the story, but I was kind of foggy on that.
Yeah.
Now, you had mentioned earlier in the podcast that Penn State hasn't won a lot recently. That brings me to some questions I had about current Penn State, stuff like that, with James Franklin. Do you think a win against the Irish changes the narrative on James Franklin, like the national narrative on James Franklin, considering that even if he does beat the Irish, there are going to be trolls on the internet, that are going to come up and say, well, he played two of the easiest teams in the playoff to get there?
It's an interesting question, because if you look, Penn State had, when you look back after the season's over, they had one team to beat in the regular season. It was Ohio State. They had them at home, and they could not beat them. Ohio State loses to Michigan, which backs Penn State. And I hate to say it this way, but it's true. Backs Penn State into the Big Ten championship game against Oregon, and Penn State can't beat them. So there's the two teams that they've played all year long that they didn't win. And they get rewarded by having to play SMU and Boise State, who I didn't think were qualified to be in the tournament to begin with. And Penn State had so much more talent. It was ridiculous when you looked at both sides of both games. And now you're playing Notre Dame, and I just talked with Frank Pomerico, who played on Notre Dame's 1973 national championship team, and he follows Notre Dame, and he's not even sure that how good Notre Dame is. And I'm not sure how good Penn State is. They're good, don't get me wrong. But are they national championship good? I don't know. And I don't think Notre Dame knows that about them either. So I'm not sure. This game will help James out if he can win it. But that's not going to hurt him, put it that way. But how much it will help him, I don't know. I think it will. But how much, I don't know.
Well, Rex, you inadvertently set up my next question then by explaining how Penn State kind of backed their way into where they're at, let's say, or into the conference championship game, and they didn't beat the two teams that were their two biggest teams on their schedule. And so here they are playing Notre Dame tomorrow for a chance to go to the national championship game. Does that sort of situation devalue a conference championship?
Yes. And I think the conference champion. Now, let me say this on two ends. I don't think the NCAA is going to get rid of them, and I think that's why they chose SMU. Because if SMU would not have been chosen in, their squawk would have been, well, if we wouldn't have played our conference championship game, we would have been in the tournament. So I think, and they're after about money. It's a money issue with the NCAA. But I don't think they have a whole lot of meaning anymore when you're going into the conference tournament, because you look at Georgia, their quarterback gets hurt in the conference championship game. And I don't think you don't hear a whole lot about that being spoken of in the media, but it's so true. If Georgia doesn't play that game, then they go into the tournament against Notre Dame with their starting quarterback. That's I think they're going to do a double check, but it's all about money. So money's going to drive everything with college football.
Well, yeah, money does now drive everything with college football, with NIL and stuff like that. Do you think that the current college football with NIL and transfer portal, do you think that's going to help or hurt Penn State moving forward? Are they adapting to the new college football as far as NIL goes? I mean, we've seen Michigan go out there and just offer boatloads of money to Bryce Underwood, the number one recruit. And I personally, to me, that's not college football. When I was younger, people that went to that school went there because they loved the school. It was an honor to go there, type of thing. But now it doesn't matter. We're past that. Your traditions be damned type of thing. Does this hurt schools? Not just Penn State, but any school that maybe doesn't have, Penn State has a large alumni base and a lot of money. I'm not saying they don't, but a school let's say that doesn't, but has a lot of tradition and pageantry, and that's what they use on the recruiting trail. Where does Penn State fall in this?
Well, I think you look, Penn State might have a lot of donor money, but a lot of those donors remember Joe Paterno, and Joe Paterno would have been against paying these players. I guarantee you that. I don't want to obviously speak for the man, but that went against his whole philosophy. You're here to get an education. And by the way, we're paying for your education with a scholarship. So, but, you mentioned Penn State, and I talked with Tim Clark, who does some podcast work on my site at pennsports.live. And we've talked about this. He's a big USC fan. And Penn State and USC are on the cusp. I don't think they have as much money as people think. So I think you're going to come down to 12 or 15 teams that are going to have a chance to win a championship. That's it. And I think USC and Penn State are in that 13, 14, 15. I'm not sure. And he said the same thing about USC. He said, Rex, they're a city school, and I'm not sure they've got a ton of money. They're complaining they need to get more NIL money, and Penn State's doing the same thing. So I'm not sure that how that's going to handle everything. I think they're in the cusp of it, but it's all going to be determined by how much money they can get to pay players. Like I said, Ohio State's about the best team money can buy.
And they're showing it too.
Yeah, they're awful good.
So then that, like you said, that could whittle it down to 12, 15 teams that really have a chance. And to me, I think you wanted to have more parity by opening up the playoff. I think all the other stuff that's gone along with it recently, like the NIL and the transfer portal, I think what you're doing is you're creating less parity for college football. And that's my opinion. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. The NFL has proven,
but I'm just looking at
it wrong. You look at the NFL. You have some good teams this year, more than a couple. But look how many 3 and 4 win teams you have. Way too many. It's incredible. And what you're going to have is the college coaches that I speak with, and I focus on the mid 60s through the early 90s. They don't like this at all, this transfer portal, and they don't like paying players. They think there's going to be 45 teams. That's it. Not 115 that we have now. It's going to get down to like two tiers, 45 teams, and then the other group. And that's what you're going to get every year. It's a Clemson, Alabama, Notre Dame, let's say Penn State, USC, Oregon, because they have Nike money, Phil Knight's Nike money. That's what you're going to have every year. And it's just going to be a matter of Ohio State, Michigan are going to be in that. Who's got better players and better coaching.
Hey, Rex, just to go back to your book real quick before we wrap this up, I was just wondering, like, who are some of did you talk to anybody? Did you have any interviews or any sources, or what kind of collaborations did you have in the making of this book?
That's a good point. Every interview I conducted was outstanding because they were kind of like idols to me as a kid. A couple that stand out. Matt Millen, obviously. It was an honor. I was privileged enough to provide him a copy of his book a month before he had his heart transplant. So I spent 3 hours with him in the hospital. And as you could probably tell, I can command a room. I didn't command that room. And I don't know how to describe it. He commanded the room from the time I walked in there. And I just sat down, and I could have sat there for 2 weeks and just listened to people coming in and out, talking to him. I thought he was that good. Tony Petruccio was another one. He's a fun guy. He doesn't give himself anywhere near enough credit. But he's a great guy to talk to. He looks like he could still play today, and he's got to be in his mid-60s. But Tony Petruccio was a nose tackle, played alongside in the middle between Clark and Millen. And he had some fun stories. One of them was when he played in the Canadian Football League and actually was a teammate of a serial killer. They didn't even know he was at the time. I wrote a little bit about it in my book in his venue. Scott Fiskey, cool. Bob Bassett. But yeah, the Mike Gooman is, I got to mention something about Mike Gooman. This guy is such a great human being. And I'm critical. I'm more critical than not. And I thought, this guy can't be that good. Matt Millen says, yes, he is, Rex. He and his wife are the greatest people you ever want to meet. I tried to find things on Mike that were negative, and I found zero. And I dug. And Mike is a good friend of mine. I think the world of the guy. I try to model my life after Mike. He's a very special man, husband, and father. And it really solidified to me. I'm glad I got a chance to look up as a kid to some of these guys because they don't come any better than Mike Gooman. That's a fact. And I have to mention that because he was kind enough to write the foreword of the book, but to get to know him. And again, now I've got to know Chuck Fucina. They're all great guys. They'll do anything for you. They welcome me to their tailgate every year that they have their reunion tailgate. I go over to Penn State every year and sit down, and I'm in awe. I sit there just to listen to these guys banter back and forth, and it's just about the old days. You know, how's your family? And in the old days, it had nothing to do with how successful you are, money, and nothing. It's great. These guys are just down home, humble guys. But the one I want to tell you too, Tony Petruccio was one. He gave me a great interview. He doesn't give himself enough credit, but he's pretty funny.
Nice. Well, Rex, thank you so much for your time. The Forgotten Seasons. It's available on Amazon. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, right here's a copy of it. I was blessed to find the cover in Penn State archives. And no, you can also check pennsports.live because I have a lot of player interviews from this time period and the early 60s and 70s on there. Actually, my oldest Penn State player was Milt Plum. I found him and interviewed him. He played in the 50s with Lenny Moore back in the day. So, yeah, there's a lot of neat stories. Mike Gooman's biography's on there, Chuck Fucina. So you can go to pennsports.live and if you want to find some supplemental information. I appreciate having you on. It was great.
Thanks, Rex. We appreciate having you. Thanks for your time, and you have a great night, okay?
You too. Thank you, folks.